Well, good evening and welcome to the Apologetics.com radio show, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. I'm Harry Edwards, your host for tonight, and I'm joined by some very good friends. And we have a full panel this evening, and I'm going to get to introduce each one of them. But my trusty friend, Mr. Apologetics himself, Lenny Esposito to my left. Lenny, how's it going?
It's going great. It's going great. We've been busy over at comereason.org. I've just done a couple of different interviews, one with Dr. Hugh Ross on his new book, Always Be Ready, another one with Dr. J.P. Moreland on scientism and secularism, and prepping for some travel and teaching some classes on science and Christianity. It's just been a busy time right now.
Speaking of travel, I know you do that in different modes.
Yes.
Most of us, when we say travel, that's car or plane. But with Lenny, sometimes he feels like he just needs to bike across town for like 65 miles one way. Tell us about that.
Well, it's, my family had a history of heart disease. And so I said, well, if I'm going to do this, better get serious about my health, and started cycling. And so I do about 150 miles a week.
Wow.
And then sometimes I'll do 100 miles in a day at Century or something like that. But yeah, just whatever I can do to keep healthy. So.
Very good, Lenny. Now, tonight we have a special program. We're actually going to be talking about this relatively new organization that got formed maybe, 3 years ago? Maybe, or longer than that?
A little longer than that.
A little longer than that.
Yeah,
all right.
But when Sarah had it.
Yeah, but they had their first conference last year, though.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And so we're going to talk about that, and I'm talking about the Women in Apologetics. So that's the name of the organization. And I have pretty much their leadership here in the studio, and we want to talk to them about the conference that's coming up this January. It's a must attend, and I know even though the name of the organization is Women in Apologetics, I've heard that men are also invited to this one, right?
Yes, they
but
are.
It's a novel new group, and I'm excited about what's coming out of the Women in Apologetics. And so I'm going to introduce Krista Bontrager, who is part of the organization, and she's part of the speaking team at Women in Apologetics. So, hi, Krista. How are you doing? Tell us how you're involved with Women in Apologetics and how, why it's important for you to be part of this group.
Well, I'm glad to be here, Harry, and I am so excited to be part of Women in Apologetics. I'm on the board, and I'm going to be speaking at the Women in Apologetics conference in January. And I think that I've been in the apologetics arena for actually 25 years, pretty close to that now. And I feel like I'm a little bit of one of the veterans in the group. But it's exciting for me to see so many eager young women coming along, discovering apologetics. I remember when I was slugging it out in seminary in the early 90s, I was often the only woman in my program and many of my classes, and I felt like, what am I doing? Is this something women can even engage in? And now it is so exciting to me to see so many young, bright faces coming along and adding their unique voice to the conversation. And I just couldn't be happier to be with a great organization. And people might also know me through my work at Reasons to Believe with my colleagues, Dr. Hugh Ross, Fuzz Rana, and Ken Samples, who've been on your show before. And I'm one of the scholars there. I'm one of the theologians on staff.
That's great. And to your left is Hillary Ferrara. Hillary, how are you doing? And tell us how you're involved with Women in Apologetics and why you're involved in it.
Well, I am the vice president of Women in Apologetics, and so I've just been involved with apologetics probably since I was about 12 years old, and it was one of the things that really grounded my faith. That when I went away to college, I realized that just with changing emotions, I'm like most women, my emotions can change quickly, but having that knowledge of the resurrection specifically really made it to where I didn't feel like walking away from the faith was an option for me, at least not intellectually. And so just no matter what happened, no matter what trials I had go through my life, I always had something that tethered me to reality in the storms. And so I want to be a part of encouraging other women in this and just showing them how you can have a reasonable, rational faith. And I also want to specifically target moms, because I feel like moms are kind of like the 1040 window of apologetics that I very rarely see an apologetics conference where they have childcare. And so a lot of times the person most interested is dad, so he goes and someone has to stay with the kids. But the moms are the ones who are always getting the questions first. So if they're the ones getting the questions, we should be equipping them to be answering the questions.
That's great. And then to your left is Lori Stewart. And tell us how you're involved, Lori, and why you're involved in Women in Apologetics.
Thanks for having us, Harry. Really appreciate this opportunity to talk about women in apologetics. I'm the president of Women in Apologetics and on the board, and it's just such a privilege to serve with such amazing women, truly. On the board, we have some just gifted apologists, female apologists, and we have dynamic speakers at our conferences, our last conference and our coming up at our January conference as well. So how did I get involved in apologetics? Well, my husband and I have been doing conferences and speaking. We have our own ministry, IntelligentFaith.com, and so my husband goes way back, John Stewart. He was on KKLA back in the 80s, and so he's an old fixture in apologetics, kind of like Krista. Goes way back and been doing this a long time. But I would go to conferences, and he would be speaking. I'd be speaking on different issues, but women were coming up and asking me apologetics questions. And I thought, why aren't they asking the men? Well, maybe they don't feel comfortable. Maybe they are looking for a woman to relate to a little bit better for some of the questions. And I looked around and there were not enough female speakers. At the conferences I was attending, there were no female speakers. And so I started asking the question and really kind of jousting some of the male apologists, saying, where are the women? And they said, Lori, maybe you need to do this. So I decided to get a formal degree, and I'm almost finished with my master's in Christian apologetics at Biola, just writing my thesis. Yeah. Of course, it'll be something related to women's issues. Yeah. But I am a lawyer by trade. That's what I do is my full-time job. And so I love the whole evidence aspect to apologetics. But I think it's important that women know not just what they believe, but why they believe Christianity is true. In today's culture, I see an increase in emotionalism, that women are becoming, well, not just women, men as well, but we just see this increase in emotionalism. And I want to really encourage women particularly to think more, to use their minds. Feelings and emotions are not bad, but we need to filter them through the lens of what we know to be true.
That's great. All right, so if you want, you guys can go to womeninapologetics.com, ladies and gentlemen. Just go there and check out the conference that's going to happen on January 11th and 12th next year. It's going to happen at Biola University. Again, like I mentioned, the men are definitely invited. What's nice about this is because there's such a focus on women, like you were saying, Lori and Krista and Hillary, that women need to be represented in these conversations. And what's unique about this is, if I'm not mistaken, there's going to be childcare, right?
Yes.
Because that's always a burden to families.
Can I speak up? Not only do we have childcare, but we have specific, it's called We Kids, and I think it's through for ages 3rd grade through 6th grade. And we have a wonderful, and she's been an elementary school teacher for 10 years, and she's just developed a curriculum called Foundations Worldview Training. It's Elizabeth Urbanowitz. She's one of our classmates at Biola, and she has just offered to provide, last year she did the first unit from her worldview curriculum, and this year she'll be doing the second unit from her worldview curriculum and just providing that free of charge. So this is my vision for seeing the parents, or and specifically, the moms and the women getting trained. And as the kids come and in the childcare, they're getting trained. The volunteers for the childcare are getting trained, because then they're teaching, and we have everybody joining in this School of Learning Apologetics.
That's great. That's great. And one of your colleagues, by the way, is listening in via phone, and she is from Florida. Rachel, you're there, right?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Perfect. I know you're connected via the phone. You can actually hear everything live, right? You're hearing the show live.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's perfect. That's great.
I'm smiling from ear to ear.
Rachel, I heard you're the glue that keeps everybody together at Women in Apologetics.
Definitely.
She is.
Tell us a little bit about your involvement with the organization and how you got involved in apologetics.
Yeah, so I'm the Executive Director of Development for Women in Apologetics. I'm also the chair on the board. Right now, what I do within Women in Apologetics is really just do a lot of the spearheading and the development and a lot of other things. I'm a Jill of all trades when it comes to different tasks that I do. But I got into the field of apologetics during college, kind of similar to Hillary in that I really experienced a lot of opposition to my faith, especially when I went to Oxford University for a term, which is a very rich academic city, a lot of worldviews there. I came from a small Christian school in Central Florida, and so it was very different going from that experience to this very large university where everybody's very analytical, very cerebral, and just everything is kind of questioned. And so I didn't have a crisis of faith necessarily because I had experiential knowledge of Christ in my life. And I had experienced apologetics in my youth as well, and that's what really led me to faith in Christ, because I had really struggled with, does God exist? So it wasn't until I really faced real-world opposition to my faith and needed to provide better answers than just my experience that I really realized apologetics is for me. Then I just started pouring into it, so...
Great. Thanks, Rachel, for sharing. So we always want to invite conversation here at the Apologetics.com radio show. So I'm going to give out the numbers. If you're out there listening, the number to call is 888-995-KKLA. That's 888-995-5552. And I'm going to be asking a question, and feel free to chime in, everybody. So here's the question. Why start an organization called Women in Apologetics?
Great question, Harry.
Yeah.
We get asked this all the time.
Yep.
You know, do you have to have something specific for women? Why don't you just call yourself an apologist? In fact, my dad always asks me this. Why do you have to say female in front of something? Why can't you just be an apologist? I think that this field has been historically dominated by men. And I think in order for us to really equip, educate, and encourage women, we needed to provide a special venue and a forum to do that. So we want to help raise up more women to be apologists because we believe that not only are we capable of competing in the academic world and on a scholarly basis, but there's a real practical need, as Hillary was talking about, for moms, for everyday people who are just have questions, or people who have questions about what they're believing or what they hear other people believing. And we need to be able to speak into those issues. And
That's great. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I support you guys. I'm excited about what you guys are doing. By the way, I mean, men, feel free to respond too. Lenny, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's really important to have a special organization for women in apologetics just to encourage women who maybe haven't considered apologetics before as something they might be interested in, but then they see women doing it and they think, oh, well, maybe this is something that I could look into too. Because when you go to apologetics conferences, typically you look up on the stage and in all candor, most of the time it's older white men. And that's kind of the stereotype of what the faces of apologetics looks like. Yeah. I think that having an organization called explicitly Women in Apologetics, it's not that apologetics is somehow necessarily special for us, although I do think there are some issues that are unique to women, but it kind of provokes the thinking a little bit that, hey, I'm a young woman in my 20s. I haven't considered this before. Maybe there could be somebody who looks like me up on the stage. My hope is that we actually inspire young women to consider incorporating apologetics into whatever discipline of knowledge they're going into.
Yeah, that's why I made sure I'm not an old white man. So
I know.
That's my claim to fame. That's
right.
I said typically, Harry.
That's just funny. That's true, though. No, that's true.
There's a perception out there that apologetics has, and sometimes because folks who, especially lay apologists, will take on a battle motif, right? And this is not something that's appealing, especially to a lot of women. Now, Holly Ordway wrote an article several years back that did a wonderful job of breaking down the different ways that one can defend their faith. And she said, yes, there's the confrontational method, and you see that many times in debates and things like that. So there's the battle. She said there's also the walking alongside, where you put your arm around a person and walk. And while that can be effective in certain instances, that doesn't really confront some of the mistakes that people have with their theology or with their worldview. But then she said, but there's a third option, and that's what she calls the dance, where you, and if you've ever taken any ballroom dance class or watched Dancing with the Stars, there's a resistance that has to happen between the dance partners. You have to push back a little bit. You can't just go all limp, then no dance happens. So you have to push back. You have to, but there is also, we're trying to work towards the same goal. It's not an adversarial approach. And this is something I think that where you can show defending the faith can be something that's not nasty, combative, brute, male driven. You can be the dance. There's a romance to the faith.
And there's something else that I've noticed, and this wasn't something necessarily that I grew up in, but because I kind of grew up being comfortable being the only woman in the room with a lot of different things. I have a really strong relationship with my dad, and so I have no problem entering the male sphere whatsoever. And so it wasn't until I got older, actually, when I encountered women in apologetics, that I realized that there are really large groups of women out there that won't read something or listen to something unless it's written by a woman. And so that's probably the thing that was the number one thing that opened my eyes to women in apologetics, of why I needed to be involved with that, is just it's this, again, it's like almost this place where you can't go. I think of some of the Muslim countries where they'll have specific rooms that you need to have female missionaries, because there's only women are allowed to go into those spheres. So if we have women out there that are only allowing other women to speak into them, and there are no female voices in this area of having reasonable, rational reasons for faith as opposed to just emotional reasons, then that to me is one of the number one reasons to be pursuing specifically women in apologetics.
Yeah, that's great, Hillary. I was going to mention that if there's anything, when I look in the field of apologetics today, if there's anything exciting, it's what you guys are doing, because when you look at demographics right now, if I'm not mistaken, I know, Lenny, you're into numbers, but it seems like there are more women who go to church than men.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, see, so that's a known fact. And can you imagine if the church is going a certain way, so who would be the most effective communicators of the gospel and its defense than a fellow woman, you know? So I love what you guys are doing, especially, I mean, Hillary, you mentioned the whole idea of just moms out there. And I just want to say that the theme for this coming January's conference is engaging the culture for Christ. I definitely want to touch on that. And we fail to recognize even just the stay-home mom, or just moms, or just mothers in general, and the amazing impact they have on kids.
Yep.
I can't think of any single thing that's more impactful than a mom to their kid. Of course, maybe close second would be both parents, right?
Yeah.
But mom to their kids, my goodness, that has just a lot of import into who they become, their character, their faith, their journey, all of that. And if you start them young, can you imagine all moms from here on out just being focused on raising their kids properly? What kind of world would we live in, right? Yeah. And we don't talk about that in churches. There's no like 12, series on these kinds of things. But your team, your organization is recognizing those kinds of things. So, and I think, Lenny, you even mentioned, I think you intimated that there's certain ways that maybe the females could communicate certain things that males can't.
There's actually an article that I guess I would point that I wrote for crossexamine.org, and I did it before our last conference last year, and it's titled, Yes, Women Need Apologetics, but more importantly, Apologetics Needs Women. And in that, I go into kind of some of the differences. I know it's not a popular thing to say right now that there are actually differences in gender, but I find that some of the things that I noticed, like number one, men pioneer, but women have a tendency to civilize. And so I've kind of joked for a while that apologetics has become this Lord of the Flies kind of landscape, and we need to have women coming in, and that they bring a relational aspect that men a lot of times are very compartmentalized in what they do, which is wonderful for how God created them. But when it comes to teaching apologetics, women have a tendency to weave into how does this affect everyday life? How does this affect relationships? It's so people like go to conferences and they get full of all this knowledge, but they don't know how to implement it. And one of the correctives for that might be a woman who, I don't know if you've ever heard men are waffles, women are spaghetti. Guys are all compartmentalized. Women, we're just this mass of noodles. Everything we believe, everything we know, everything we feel touches every other part of our life. And that's how we present. And that's different than the way men present.
Well, go ahead.
I think, too, as a mom and raising two kids, I think that what I've seen is the culture that I've tried to build in our home, that asking questions is a noble thing. Mm. That is part of our value system as a family. Being proactive at the dinner table with my children from a young age of asking them questions that I already know going into it, either they've never thought about or they definitely don't know the answer to. But I would much rather be the person who provokes that conversation in my children first, so that they've actually heard that question before they go out into the world or into an educational system. And I regularly made a habit of putting my children on the spot. And they got real good at making up an answer real quick. And it was fun. And that was part of the culture that we built in our home. But I think that that's an important aspect of apologetics that women bring to it is how do we bring this into the family? Mm. How do we bring this into our everyday lives? When I'm talking out at the soccer field with other gals and we're just kind of awkwardly sitting there, how do we begin to build a community and bring apologetics into everyday conversations?
Yeah, that's great.
We have actually a writer for Mama Bear Apologetics that did a series called Playground Apologetics that's specifically about being a mom on the sidelines. How do you start these conversations? And then she basically went out and practiced the conversations and reported how they went. And sometimes they flopped and sometimes they went great. But I love the concept of, just doing everyday life with other women and how do you bring it in?
I love it. See, what I'm hearing when I'm listening to you all talk about this is that you guys are actually building and creating culture. So let's just get into it. All right, so your theme is engaging the culture for Christ. You're talking about moms and trying to get better at apologetics because kids are beginning to ask questions. You're inviting those questions at the dinner table. That's actually a new cultural thing. So Before we just proceed into the show, let's define our terms. What is culture? So again, their theme for this January's conference is engaging the culture for Christ, which is very commendable. I love it. But what do we mean by culture? Oh, Rachel, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, feel free to speak.
So, okay.
Yeah. Share.
So. Yeah, culture is basically what we create, what we do. We talk about, for instance, not to go off on a tangent, but politics. For instance, how we engage with politics has a lot to do with our worldview, our morals, and the things that we want to see changed. And within politics, there are going to be different worldviews that are spouted. So for us as Christians, it's like we have this worldview where we believe in Jesus Christ, we believe in a moral lawgiver, we believe that there is objective truth in the world, and that we want to influence culture, we want to influence politics in that way. So culture to me is what we collectively create, and the things that we do.
So we're trying to make a distinction between what you just said and, let's say, races. Like, for instance, I'm of the Filipino race and some of you are of Italian race or African American. We're not talking about those kinds of things. We're talking about somebody shared, things we share in common.
Shared values.
Shared
yes. Practices,
Correct.
Rituals. I think these are all things that help make up culture. And we can belong, I think, to multiple cultures. I have a work culture. Mm-hmm. There's a church culture. Sometimes church cultures become very unhealthy and we feel like we need to leave them. There's family cultures. There's the broader culture. There's sometimes cultures based on ethnicity. If I'm an Italian and I have a large Italian family, that's a culture. So we can belong to multiple cultures.
Right. And I like how we're clarifying those distinctions. I'm totally all for that. To me, it's in the doing that makes culture. Like, for instance, during the break, we said, or I shared that in essence, really, God creates and then we also create. So God creates. When we create, that becomes culture. So I'm hearing the music come on. That means we're halfway done. We will go to a station break, and then right after that, we will continue our discussion on culture, engaging the culture for Christ with Women in Apologetics.
Now I gotta make my rounds. Where can I lay you down? I'm gonna miss your love tonight.
The mission of Apologetics.com is to challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe on the radio, on the internet, and now in the Life of the Mind conferences. If you believe in the work that Apologetics.com is doing, we encourage you to support us with your prayers and also with your tax-deductible gift so that this ministry will continue on the air, on the web, and in events near you. Gifts of any amount are appreciated, and it's very simple to participate. Just go to Apologetics.com and click Donate. It's safe and secure. Or you can send your check or money order to Apologetics.com, 1900 Southwestern Avenue, San Pedro, California, 90732. Thank you for supporting Apologetics.com.
All right, let's get back to the Apologetics.com radio show.
All right, good evening and welcome back to the Apologetics.com radio show. I guess we have Wonder Women with us this evening. I love it. And I'm so excited about Women in Apologetics that I can't say enough about it. Go to their site. I would encourage you guys to attend the conference that's coming up in January. And a lot of the information, you can just look it up on their site. We were talking about culture before the break. And again, we're trying to make a distinction between races, R-A-C-E-S, races. You might be of African descent, you might be Asian. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about values that we have in common. And so like Os Guinness would really define it simply, it's a way of life lived in common. I know Andy Crouch, famous for his culture-making book. He defines culture as what human beings make of this world. Kevin Van Hooser, a distinguished theologian, just says it's a lived-out worldview. I like that. That's very much connected with our favorite topic, apologetics, right? And that makes a lot of sense. I know for me, having read William Edgar's new book on created and creating, I simply just call culture things we do. Because eventually, if more than one person does it, then that's a shared doing. And then before you know, it's a habit. And because of the doing comes different outlooks in life. And so, like, for instance, Hillary, you shared mom's doing X. Well, I mean, if you get another woman to do the same thing, you're literally creating culture.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if that becomes a culture in a church, like a 500-member church? That's not so hard to imagine.
Yeah.
But can you imagine from that church now, because they all share that value and they see the successes, they see their kids performing well at school and they're good, men and women, and then other communities will point to that church and go, they're doing something right there. What are they doing? Let's imitate what they're doing.
That's a good point. And something I would actually like to ask you guys, because I've talked with several women who kind of eschew women's ministries in churches because they're tired of every conference being about,
how many people you can make cry. It's
bake
like
sales
a cry fest.
and sewing crafts. And she goes, hey, I want the theology too. So what do you see there, and how do you suggest getting to the leadership in those churches to say, hey, you're having a conference, at least have one speaker who can wrestle with some real issues of life in a way that's intellectually fulfilling? What do you think is the barriers there? Why are they there? And how do you overcome them?
Well, I think, first of all, we're commanded in the scriptures to do apologetics. I think everybody is, because 1 Peter 3:15 says we need to be ready to give an answer. We need to explain to people why we believe what we do. We're also called to make disciples. So I believe apologetics is a species of evangelism and discipleship. Therefore, we're all called to do it. I think that we don't just have a problem with trying to get women in apologetics in the church. We're still trying to get apologetics in the church.
Yeah,
I have a presentation I do. It's called Apologetics, the New Bad Word and Why We Need It. We have people writing books on the end of apologetics. Is it really the end? No, I think maybe it's just the end of a certain method and style that hasn't been as effective. And I think we need to revisit. And I think we have some very creative women who are doing that. We have women who are using art, music, to reach out and to give a defense and give evidence for why they believe that Christianity is true. But the culture that we're trying to engage can be the culture. The manicurist who I'm talking to while I'm getting my nails done might be asking me questions about the problem of evil. And I can engage her at that level on a one-on-one basis. But we can also engage on a larger basis. Maybe it's in social media, talking about the Kavanaugh hearings and the responses that I saw. I was so taken aback by some of the responses, I think, on both sides of the issue. We want to be able to offer that there is a reasoned way that we can approach very difficult subjects, from racism, from the Women's March, from feminist issues, from abortion, from transgenderism, the Me Too movement. Let's engage the culture on the hot topics today in a well-reasoned and thoughtful way.
Sorry, you go.
I think that, Lenny, your question about how do we get into the local church, or how do we get more attention, because I've had that struggle many years, and I'll admit I have not been overly involved in the women's ministry at my church, probably for that very reason, is that I just don't see that there's a lot there for me sometimes. It's like it is often in women's ministries has a stereotype of being a more emotional approach to the faith. And that works for some women, but there are some women who want a more analytical approach. And I think that there needs to be something available for them too. And in the conversations I have with women, they want to know where there's a place for them. And I would like to encourage pastors to think about what women are being left behind in their church. Like, what kind of culture, since we're talking about cultures, what kind of culture are they creating in their local church for women to learn about their faith? Is there cultural value system in place that women are invited to learn about their faith?
Absolutely.
I just want to give out the number. I know we have 2 callers on standby, so thanks for your patience. We'll get to you very quickly, but for those of you interested in our discussion, the number to call is 888-995-KKLA. That's 888-995-5552. I want to go to Gretchen, who has been patiently waiting, and she has a question. Hi, Gretchen. You're on the air with Apologetics.com. Do you have a comment or question?
I have several, actually, but I'm so happy to hear you. And I heard Josh McDowell when I was young during Vietnam in a big auditorium at Northern Arizona University. The point is, he had written a book about an inch thick. You know about his book, Josh McDowell?
Evidence that demands a verdict.
Yes.
Exactly. And I wondered if any women have taken the test, such as Lee Strobel, even made a movie on that, to publish. That's one of my comments.
Well, I'll say there's several different ones that are out there right now. Natasha Crane, one of my good friends, has written a book for parents. She has 2 of them right now. One of them is called Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, and it goes through, I think, 40 questions that kids are likely to ask. She has a second one called Talking with Your Kids About God, which is excellent. And it gives you conversation guides that you can have with your kids to bring up these topics. And then my ministry, I'm with Women in Apologetics, but I'm also with Mama Bear Apologetics, and we have a book that is coming out probably in June. And it's going to be dealing with a lot of the foundational worldview things, kind of like postmodernism and naturalism and feminism and even Marxism, which I hadn't originally planned on putting in the book, and realized that this is a theme that is coming back over and over. So Mary Jo Sharp has some basic women's studies on for women's groups on why do you believe that, I believe is what it's called.
Melissa Cain Travis'
I was just
new
about
book
to say,
is
Melissa Cain
wonderful.
Travis's new book, Science in the Mind of the Maker, where she goes through a lot of the scientific arguments. Oh, and Holly Ordway's book on the imagination in apologetics, where she really describes how the role of imagination in apologetics, that sometimes people can't really grasp the intellectual answers until they can imagine what is the meaning behind this and why does this matter. And she does an excellent job of basically bringing very, very cultural topics into apologetics. So those are some of the ones I would recommend.
And I've written a couple of books through Reasons to Believe, integrating kind of science and faith issues, really focusing on what does the Bible have to say. I wrote a small group study on Genesis 1 and 2 called The Bigger Picture on Creation, and I also wrote an in-depth Bible study on Psalm 104 and integrating that with science. So there's definitely women are on the rise.
Yeah, I know, Gretchen, that was a lot of information, but just so you know.
No, I've written it down.
Oh, wow.
She's a fast writer.
Hey, Harry, let me just say one more thing. If you go to womeninapologetics.com, we have resources. So make use of our website.
Yes.
You will have a list of female apologists right there. You click on them. You can go to their links, see their books, their blogs. We have an enormous amount of material available for you.
And we also
have you ever heard of BSA, Bible Science Association?
The Bible Science Association? I don't believe I've heard of that.
Hey, Gretchen, I just want to, sorry, I need to interrupt you.
I wanted to come to the conference. I love you.
Okay.
You wanted to say something else. I interrupted. What was it?
No, I was going to say we need to move on to our next caller, Gretchen. I just want to say thank you for your call and keep listening, okay?
Well, thank you. I just love hearing this.
Oh, you're welcome. All right, so I want to go now to Ken, calling from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Wow, that's amazing. All right.
You're
Ken,
up late.
I know. So, Ken, thanks for your patience. You've been waiting, and you're on the air with Apologetics.com. How can we help you? Do you have a question or comment?
Mine is more of a comment.
I know who this is. This is my friend Ken Wogamuth.
Oh, okay.
Isn't it?
Well, I know her. I know Hillary.
I know you.
Hillary is one of the very first persons that I showed some science and faith kind of questions years ago at a NISCA meeting.
Very good.
Well, thanks for your call. Yeah.
I just wanted to encourage all of you for the following reason. I'm a geologist, and in my profession, there is Association for Women Geoscientists. It got started back in the 1980s. And it has had a tremendous influence on the geoscience community. And about 5 years ago, there was the first president of the American Association of Petroleum Geologists. There was a woman. And so in the president's get-together, here she was with all these men from, 50 years of petroleum geology. And now she is the president of the Geological Society of America, which has its meeting next week that we're going to go to, so I'll see her again. So this is just a word of encouragement, kind of congratulations, and press on and bring good, solid apologetics. And I really am thrilled to hear the apologetics for the home environment for our next generation, which is so critical.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Ken.
Gee, Ken, you could say that's almost a tectonic shift in...
It is a tectonic shift.
It just rocks.
And in fact,
I see what you did there.
Every time you see that map of the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean basins with all the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, it was a woman at Columbia University who was involved in making those early maps back in the 1960s.
Wow. All right.
So anyway.
Well, thanks, Ken, for your call. Appreciate it.
Right. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Good evening. All right. That's great. Again, if you want to join our discussion, feel free to call us 888-995-KKLA or 5552. All right. So now that was exciting. We're talking about culture. I'm curious, for those of you who were involved in putting together this conference, why did you guys pick culture, engaging culture? What's that mean to you? I know I heard some of the, you mentioned how things are getting pretty worse, but let's get practical here. What are some of the ways, maybe as you think through the themes, and I know you all are speakers at the conference, help us understand how your topics are going to be engaging the culture.
Well, I think for me, I'm going to be giving one of the plenary talks, and if people go on my website at theologymom.com or visit my YouTube channel everywhere on social media, I'm Theology Mom. And last year I did about a 30-part series on the image of God at my church, and just really reflected deeply on what I saw happening in our wider American culture. Was a lot of conversations that to me all had one tie in common, and that is that there's an answer for those things within the Christian worldview, and it connects to the image of God. That all humans are created with value, dignity, and worth simply because they are human beings. And so I explored topics like human rights versus animal rights, things related to the unborn, reproductive technologies, end-of-life issues, but also things like the rise of the Me Too movement, and that has become hugely politicized, but really has some very important connections and overlap with the Christian worldview and the value and dignity of women. Conversations about race. I think that the race conversation on social media it's insane. You cannot have a rational discussion about race issues. I think in social media and even one-on-one, it's hard, it's challenging. But the image of God is a central piece of how we need to start talking about race. So for the talk that I'm going to be doing is really just a diving deep into the image of God and how I see that as applying to so many of the cultural conversations that we need women to be speaking into, but for moms to be talking to their children about.
Yeah, that's great.
When Lori and I were talking earlier about what we thought of for culture, and one of the things that happens when I kind of think through things is a lot of times I get pictures in my head of just kind of word pictures, and the picture that I got in my head was soup, and kind of like this idea of stew, where you have all these individual pieces of meat or vegetables, but you also have this broth that all of it is sitting in, and basically it's either absorbing stuff that's in the stew or it's releasing part of what it has inside of it into the stew. So it's doing both. It's absorbing and it's releasing. So I see culture as kind of being like that broth, and we are all in it, and we are either absorbing what the culture is giving us, or we're starting to redeem the culture like Christ has asked us to. So I'll be speaking specifically about science and faith, and I'll be talking kind of from one of the chapters that I did for the Mama Bear book on naturalism and how that is really seeped into our culture. There's a book called, what is it? Well, Barna Research did a study on why youth are leaving the church. And out of the 6 reasons that they cited, one of the main ones was there was a perceived conflict between religion and science, or between Christianity and science. And so there I was a biology and chemistry teacher, and I thought, I really want to know what is being said about this from a secular worldview. And so I specifically went and got a master's in biology so I would be able to speak into this area. And I just want to be able to kind of speak into our culture that there isn't a divide between science and God. There's a divide between Christianity and naturalism, but naturalism and science are not the same thing. And a lot of times people want to make it the same thing. They're being told that science is the only way to get knowledge. And if a child is growing up thinking that science is the only way for real knowledge to occur, then that's going to leave them wondering, well, what about these other areas of knowledge? How can I know that? So women and parents need to know how to speak into them and basically correct the misunderstandings before they snowball basically into a very anti-Christian worldview.
That's great. That's great.
We have a variety of speakers talking on great topics that are just, I think, so relevant for the culture today. We're going to talk about not just women's issues, but we're going to talk about truth. We're going to talk about science. We'll talk about Jesus. We'll talk about progressive Christianity. We really have something for everyone.
Yeah,
that's wonderful. I know you mentioned, Hillary, that whole idea of scientism and secularism. I say that specifically because J.P. Moreland, we're all in some ways disciples of him, the grandfather of apologetics, the intellectual apologetics. But he just came out with a book. Yep. Lenny, I know you interviewed him. You want to talk about that? I mean, J.P., I think this is one of his most favorite books.
Yeah, he said it's one of the 3 most important books he's written of all time. Right. Because, and what he had said is basically the biggest problem with scientism is that nobody knows what it is, but everybody believes it. Right. And we've just absorbed it in the culture, and that's part of our cultural milieu in which we're forced into. So that's why even in the church, people have assumed a type of scientism that they don't even understand. Yeah. And let's go with that. Like in the church, so we've absorbed, using Hillary's terms, some of this not so helpful cultural things. Well, even in apologetics, let's get real. Let's get real self-reflective here. Most of the arguments from God, where do you hear them? Where's all the focus on? It's on natural theology, right? The evidences, right?
Propositional knowledge.
How do we ever talk about the beauty? Yeah. How about an aesthetic apologetic? That's a fascinating area that we can develop that would probably be very persuasive and appealing to a younger demographic.
Rachel's actually doing some work on that. Rach, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. I'm actually I'm finishing up my master's at Biola as well. That's kind of how we all met, right?
Yeah.
Actually, Craig Hazen is overseeing a project that I'm working on this spring and summer on the kind of intersection between apologetics and the arts, and I'm looking at researching conversion experiences where people have engaged with the arts that really conveyed some kind of Christian truth, or just truth in general, because we believe that all truth is God's truth, right? So even if it's not something produced by a Christian artist, but something which really resonates with someone that whether it's talking about evil or your mortality, that basically calls that person to want to seek Christ or seek truth. And so I'm really interested in how the arts play a role in that, because oftentimes people aren't really interested in picking up a book on theology or apologetics, but they may love the arts. And of course, we all engage with arts every day, graphics, TV, movies, you name it. Pulp culture is flooded with the arts, and so we're constantly being given these messages through the arts. Well, Christians can really speak into that as well, and so that's why I think there is a lot, like Lenny said, to be said about the aesthetics and how we can actually use the arts to convey truth and Christian meaning.
You even look back into medieval culture where they were making those elaborate churches with the stained glass, and the purpose of the stained glass in the art was to convey the biblical message to people who were illiterate, who couldn't read, because they knew that images are, I think that's why we're returning to this very image-based culture, because images are something that everybody can communicate with no matter what kind of educational level that they have.
Yeah,
and
look
so,
at Instagram.
Oh, yeah. It's, extremely powerful. And so, but apologetics has shied away from it because you can't put beauty into a propositional knowledge. You can't put beauty into a syllogism.
See, that's not necessarily true. I think that beauty is as objective as morality. And I think that you need to base both on God, right? Nobody looks at a glorious sunset and says,
right,
that's just beautiful to me.
Yeah.
Right. So again, we've assumed too much about what proof entails.
Yeah.
And that's
actually
right.
my husband would agree.
I
was just going to say, my
I think
husband
there's
did.
a difference between beauty and sorry.
That's okay. We keep talking.
And preference. Lenny, I absolutely agree with you. I think there's objective beauty in the world, just like what you said, like a sunset, perfect example. But there's a difference between that and then preference. I like this artist or I like this kind of book. Right? That's different. But we can agree that there's subjective beauty, but there's also objective beauty. And where does that objective beauty come from? Where do we get that collective?
Well, yeah.
idea?
When we look at a mother holding a child, it doesn't matter how aesthetically pleasing the child himself is, right? People ask me, right? You have a kid, and you say, "Does he look like the mother or the father?" I said, "I don't know. He looks like Winston Churchill." I don't. But there's something about a mother holding a child that is there's a beauty there that just supersedes the surface level.
Transcends our understanding.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
I think you raise a really good point that now we are putting a premium on the subjective. We have really lost the value for the objective. Abdu Murray wrote a really good book, Saving Truth, and he talks about how we are living in a post-truth era now. We've moved beyond postmodernism, and now we're in this age of relativism. Now we've moved into a post-truth era where the people actually recognize there is a truth, but they prioritize their feelings and their preferences, i.e. the subjective, over facts, which are the objective. So they're not so much like, hey, your truth is true for you, my truth is fine for me. We're moving away from that. Yeah. And we're seeing, for example, I'll just bring up the Kavanaugh hearing. We're not as concerned about the facts. We have feelings, we have preferences, and that takes priority over whatever the facts are showing.
Yeah, that is a scary thing, and I'm glad we're even touching a little bit on that, because as you were sharing, my mind is thinking, and this is really dangerous if we're applying it in culture. When we move away from truth, and literally we're saying, yes, there's we're not denying truth. There is truth, but we're saying I'd rather reject that over my preference. And like just what you said, well, guess who gets to adjudicate which project succeeds? Well, it's the one with power. So now it becomes coercion and power. Literally, the people who have the guns. Let's just say it that way.
Mob rule.
Mob rule. Yeah, this is a dangerous time. These are dangerous times we're in, when we're actually saying there is truth, and we're even saying, yeah, there is God, but it's really my way or violence.
We've put a I don't know what that would be, an adjective before truth. Instead of being the truth, it's my truth. She lives his truth. And this is one of the themes we ended up going over and over again in the Mama Bear book, is looking at the pre-modern, the modern, the postmodern, and then now what we're in, which we just call the time of emotionalism, where the stronger the feeling, the more true it is. And so you have people that are almost hyping themselves up on emotion, because the more emotion they can feel and the more emotion they can elicit in someone else, then the more of a right that they have to speak, and the more true something becomes, or the better they've made their point. It's almost like that's replaced logical argumentation as the strength of emotion that you can elicit in somebody else. Yeah.
I think another area where I would love to see more apologetics work, in addition to aesthetics and beauty, is in the supernatural. As we're living in a culture that is, in some aspects, we're careening more toward naturalism. There's other aspects of the culture that are careening more toward the supernatural. Yeah. And it's becoming, I think, harder and harder to discern the spirits behind the supernatural. And in my ministry experience, I've done quite a lot of work in that area. And we don't want to pit apologetics against the supernatural, because the supernatural is a big part of our case. The resurrection is almost the ultimate miracle, that someone who was dead came back to life. But we don't want to make the error of completely disregarding the supernatural here and now. And because people in our culture are longing to see something beyond themselves. Yep. So that's another whole area that I think that we have some work and we could continue to explore.
Elisa Childers will actually be doing a talk at the Women in Apologetics conference on the new spirituality, and she's actually contributed a chapter to the Mama Bear book on the new spirituality that kind of talks about this hodgepodge of spiritualism that people are going to, kind of in reaction to the hypernaturalism. We're seeing a polarization, not just in politics, but even in just that naturalism versus supernaturalism.
So if we could just encourage everybody who's interested, check out our website, check out our conference, come, men and women, everybody, you're invited, womeninaapologetics.com.
Thanks, Lori. That's a great way to end our show. It's nearly over, and our hope and prayer is that you've learned something valuable, insightful, and meaningful about the importance of being culturally engaged, and hope you've gained some practical insight on how each of us are contributors to the culture. A special thank you to my guests this evening, Lenny Esposito, Krista Bontrager, Hillary Ferrara, and Lori Stewart, and, of course, Rachel, who's been patiently on the phones. So, again, thank you to all of you, our supporters. If you've missed any part of this show, it's going to be on apologetics.com. Also, we podcast this on iTunes. So God bless you all, and have a good night.